Hello everyone, this is Philosophy for the People with Stefan Bertram. We have a very rare TIR double biller tonight. I will be going ahead now and talking about the current immigration crisis in Britain, and lightly kind of like how the left should generally understand immigration, blah, blah, blah. And then an hour after this, Jason will be on talking to the bassist from Megadeth, I think, which sounds neat, sounds cool. Means I'll definitely be done by the hour, because in exactly 1 hour, Jason definitely needs his YouTube channel back. It's just me today, as I mentioned last week, but I'll say again now. Ben's probably not going to be back for a while. I'm going to try and do these every week, but maybe I won't. I was thinking today I haven't really focused on why we shouldn't have open borders, but presumably quite a lot of people who watch TAR and give them an argument might think we should have open borders. So maybe actually I can just do an immigration double biller, and next week I actually wind back and talk more generally about why we shouldn't have open borders. But yes, immigration in contemporary Britain, Brexit, Boris, and boats. Again, I'm going to start with an actual summary of the perspective. I think in the UK, and this may be a contrast with the US, but I'm not sure it is entirely. In the UK, the left has very little to say about migration. This was not a bad idea during Corbyn. When Brexit happened in the UK, we didn't leave the European Union. We didn't leave the European Union for like 5 years. But the Brexit vote happened. And everyone was like, okay, we've done Brexit. That means Europeans can't freely come into Britain. That means the immigration issue is solved. And it seemed for a time that people stopped caring about immigration. Immigration went massively down in polling. It's something people cared about. People were really not interested. And in that time, it was perfectly, not just reasonable, but like the right thing to do for the British left to not really talk about migration. And to be clear, I'm making a distinction here by talking about immigration and talking about deportation, and similar things like that. Deportation is still a topic on the UK left, but I don't think really talking about immigration is. This kind of refusal to talk about immigration can lead to this almost like idealism, where instead of not talking about immigration, when immigration is brought up, you'll just claim that immigration has absolutely no effect on material conditions at all, which is again different from kind of more liberals' perspective of saying like diversity is our strength. We need lots of immigration in order to like keep our age pyramid the right shape, and in order to get people to work in jobs that natives don't want to do or whatever else. The British left doesn't even really seem interested in doing that. Just the only argument is there is like, don't think about it, don't worry about it, don't argue about it. Let's focus on other economic issues. Say we do accept. Imagine I've done this the other way around, and we did a one on open borders last week, and everyone agreed with me that we shouldn't have open borders, either during capitalism or during like a minimally socialist country. That doesn't solve the actual issue here, because the actual issue here, the brutal issue, is that regardless of what your perspective on immigration is, apart from having open borders, and then you just have a whole host of other problems, the ultimate problem is enforcement. How do you enforce a border without it being murderous? How do you enforce a border without having like this system? The UK, as I'll discuss later, has this horrible, horrible asylum system, where it's not just that migrants are kept in terrible conditions, but they're not even deported or given asylum. They're just left to rot, basically. The system is incredibly inefficient at both deporting people and in kind of letting them have asylum. I don't know how it works in other countries, but in the UK, migrants, asylum seekers can't work for as long as they aren't given asylum. And so they're in this like, they basically live in purgatory for so long, which doesn't benefit them or anyone in Britain or anyone in the world. But yet the system continues on and is enormously expensive at the same time. It was kind of this anti-Eastern European immigration. There was an Eastern European immigration wave to Britain, and that led to significant anti-Eastern European racism in the UK. And this was combined with the first wave of stuff about grooming gangs coming out. I don't know to what extent non-British listeners know what grooming gangs are. I'm not honestly sure to what degree I know what grooming gangs are. The whole issue is shrouded kind of in deep, deep darkness, which is only really emerging into the light now. But this thing about grooming gangs, concerns about Islamization, all this were added onto concerns by the EU stripping back British sovereignty, was what resulted in Brexit. Of course, initially after Brexit, migration went down. Concerns about migration massively went down, like disproportionately to the amount that immigration was going down. And obviously shows that concerns about immigration, it's not like, while immigration has real material effects on the countries involved, and these effects can be very much negative, that doesn't then mean that kind of every racist is really well informed about these kind of material changes that immigration brings along and how they affect the world. Rather, concern about migration is often driven by perceptions. And the perception after Brexit was that we dealt with this issue. And then, during the height of COVID, Boris Johnson decided, for indeterminable reasons, to quadruple migration to Britain, raise it by twofold higher than it ever been at any time in British history, ever. People, you can't even go back to like Saxon invasions or whatever, because they weren't bringing hundreds and thousands of people all in 1 year. And then the issue roared back into prominence because of course it did. Not just because migration happened, but because after, Britain's been on decline for a very long time, but especially after COVID, it became incredibly clear. And there's just this permanent malaise and feeling of decline across the whole country at the same time. This has been added onto the fact that the grooming gang scandal is finally being unpicked now. And this is then kind of combined, like there's anger about grooming gangs, but it's not really directed towards people that are actually could be involved in grooming gangs, but it's directed towards asylum hotels as part of the wave of violence and kind of murderous rage against asylum seekers, which led to wide-scale riots last year. Were you not for Brexit originally? I'm glad someone can remember my views from long ago. But yeah, of course, I mean, I was for Brexit then. I never stopped believing in Brexit. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything now. And obviously the thing is, what Brexit offered was a chance for us to gain some degree of independence from kind of the European system. But what has been decided by British government since then, especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that it's not what we're going to do. So while we kind of have the legal possibility of being de-aligned with Europe, the British ruling class has still decided to remain in alignment with them. Thank you, Luke. That's very kind of you. I think even to say that the left in Britain has a perspective that immigration is good gives it too much substance. It's more like the left is saying, this isn't something we should talk about. And they're only willing to talk about the secondary effects of immigration, i.e. deportation, i.e. far-right organizations trying to incite over asylum seekers and so on. There isn't nothing here. Like, this isn't a completely illegitimate perspective. In some sense, immigration policy doesn't matter in the grandest sense about capitalism. There will never be no immigration, and there will never be total or kind of open borders under capitalism. And while immigration, the movement of human capital, is one tool that is used by capitalists to kind of control the economy, affect the labor market and so on, they have plenty of other tools. we should examine all the tools of the masters and see how they'd be put to work. The fact that immigration isn't like the number one issue which decides everything, as it's tracked by some on the right, doesn't mean that on the topic we should just fall completely silent. And the anger about immigration in Britain follows two broad lines, the material and the cultural, and I expect this is copied this is, I don't think this is anything peculiar to Britain here, but quite a normal thing. Randy says, I prefer no borders or nations. Me too, but that doesn't really affect kind of how we should think about things politically, unless there is like a plan for us together. Concerns about these material concerns include both concerns about services, employment, and crime. And the only bit that I think might be kind of particular to Britain here is concerns about services, which I don't think play as large role in the United States, mainly because you don't really have very many services. By this, I mean public services. Public services and employment concerns, while distinct, follow the same pattern. We only have X of Y. We only have so many bed spaces in hospitals. We only have so many jobs. We only have so many of this or so many of that. And immigrants are taking a share. In the case of services, it's claimed that they're taking a disproportionate share, which is sometimes true, sometimes not. And that we can ill afford to not have these for ourselves. The crime concern is distinct from this and basic. Immigrants are coming here and engaging in disproportionate crime, which again sometimes is true, sometimes it isn't. Cultural concerns blur into racialist ones pretty rapidly. But the basic point here is one that I'm sure everyone can make out. Muslims or black people or Poles or whatever are alien to British culture and should not be admitted here because it will cause the dissolution of all the things which are regarded as good about British culture. This was previously done in a very old-fashioned conservative sense, but now you have like a pseudo-woke approach to this, where you denounce immigrants for not supporting gay rights and so on. The left is generally dismissive of material concerns about immigration and actively and severely hostile to any sort of cultural concern. As regarding material concerns, the left's response in Britain is that we should just focus on the expansion of these things instead of fighting over who gets what remains. This again is a very genuine point, is in some sense decisively correct, but there are limits to our ability to expand. It's not like we can build an infinite number of homes in the UK. Like I don't really believe in concerns about like, oh, we're running out of space or anything like this, but there is just a certain limit to the amount that Britain can grow, Britain can build, Britain can expand these services. And this is especially notable because this would require like crash economic growth, which is a thing that many on the left are growing increasingly suspicious of. Like the Greens are kind of the people who are the most pro-migration in the UK, but also the ones who are most skeptical of just building loads of stuff. As regarding crime, the left takes a very similar account to the one they have taken regarding immigration. They think we should say nothing at all. As in, I don't mean just about immigration, but rather the left just doesn't say anything about crime, really, in the UK. And so discussing the idea that immigrants come here and commit more crimes is far from being spoken about. The left doesn't talk about immigration, the left doesn't talk about crime. So talking about crimes committed by immigrants is something the left is not going to talk about, apart from accusing the people who want to talk about it of being racist, which is normally almost always true. But at the same time, you don't win an argument by calling someone else racist. You have to call them racist and then kind of get into it with them. Cultural issues are regarded as fundamentally fascistic. This is despite the issue that the left not being all neutral on these sort of issues, and are heavily committed on certain cultural lines. The left kind of takes this attitude of like, oh, well, it doesn't matter what the cultural issues or the cultural views of the people who come into this country have, but at the same time are very much concerned with the cultural views of the people who are already in this country. And a bonus special problem as regarding immigration for the left is that the right doesn't have to give a shit about, because they don't have reasons to care about other countries, but the left does, is, what effect does immigration have on the country of origin? The movement of human capital from the periphery to the center is part of the same general process of imperialism as all other movements of capital. There's, of course, a decisive difference here, however, though, because we have no reason to value the movement, the freedom of the movement of capital in of itself. Being a Dengist myself, I obviously do believe that often the free movement of capital is good, but it's not an intrinsic good. It's only good in the fact that it has certain positive consequences in terms of development of the mode of capitalism, so that we can eventually have socialism and blah 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 blah. But the decisive difference with human capital is human capital is embodied capital, which ought to have rights and freedoms. We should be concerned with the expression of human freedom in the form of wanting to move around the world, even if we can also abstract it away in terms of human capital flows or whatever. So we should concern ourselves more with the freedom of human capital, while at the same time not valuing it above everything else. And we should concern ourselves with the danger this movement presents to imperialized countries. There's a concern with some countries in the world that they're being brain drained by, say, the United States. That kind of all of the best top level of people are coming from certain countries and moving to the United States or other countries. What's happening in the European Union is something much worse than that, something much more decisive, something which is like almost annihilatory to the countries involved, which is in countries like Bosnia. I think Bosnia is probably the worst, but I think also the Baltic states are quite bad. In Bosnia, half of the population has left the country. Bosnia is on the road to just completely not existing as a country, or existing as basically, like a few 100,000 people, as like a nature reserve / retirement home / beach place. There aren't many beaches, you know what I mean? Like a holiday home place in the mountains and the hills and whatever. For Bosnia to basically become a country that's only aesthetic, where it's a museum, a living history museum or something like this, while actually its concreteness as a country is totally destroyed and annihilated by the fact that they're just a poor country within the European Union, and human capital is allowed to move basically entirely freely inside the European Union. So some nations are likely to just be entirely annihilated by this process, which, I'm not completely and utterly concerned about, because I ultimately don't really care what nations exist. But I'm aware that other people do care about this sort of thing. And I think there's something at least kind of sad about Bosnia just being totally destroyed by migration flows. What is the right position? Is there an obvious right position? I don't mean a right-wing position. I mean, what is the correct position? I do think we have to accept that under minimally socialist or capitalist government, immigration must be restricted. We can try to have as much immigration as we could, and that would involve massive amounts of building, massive amounts of construction, in order to try and prepare a country for more and more people come into it without diminishing and actually accelerating the quality of the life of the people inside of it. And of course, migration would help in that, because it produces kind of fresh human capital. But socialists should concern themselves, as I've mentioned, with limiting the harm both to the country that's depart from and the country that is being arrived to by this human flow. Like, in a hypothetical world where there is an agreement between the People's Republic of Nigeria and the People's Republic of Britain, where, okay, lots of Nigerians are allowed to come to the UK, but at the same time, a lot of British people have to go to Nigeria, we would be much better off, compared to just allowing the free movement of loads of human beings from poorer countries into richer ones, which only kind of reinforces the structure of imperialism. And maybe I'm now just giving in to the same tendency I want to critique here, that I'm saying cultural concerns are real, but socialist politics comes anyway with an effort to transform these cultures, the culture that we live in, and kind of these issues aren't, I think broadly these issues will solve themselves. And maybe that is me being a coward and me not being brave enough to kind of address these things, I don't think so. But all of this is basically irrelevant, because how do you then approach the actual thorny part of this issue, the actual problem with migration, which is going on in the UK, which is less the macro issue of the people coming in. It's actually focused on a very small minority of the people that are coming in, which is people that come in boats and people who otherwise come illegally and become asylum seekers. And they're not the main issue purely contingently, but are the issue for these quite structural reasons, because they are the main problem as regarding enforcement. The problem with actually saying, oh, we should have restrictions on immigration is then how do you enforce this without being entirely inhuman? How do you enforce this without killing anyone? How do you enforce this without enforcing great indignities upon both the population of people that are already living in a country and the population of people who want to live in a country? It's not clear what the answer to that question is, so let's instead talk about the last 20 years of immigration to the United Kingdom. Soon is suggesting in chat that there could be an adoption of systems in Asia which allow guest workers but not permanent relocation. I mean, obviously that's one option, but you would kind of only want that option. I think the thing is to acknowledge that people being able to move around the world and live where they want is a good, but it's not an overwhelming good. So you could adopt a system like that where the situation is really quite dire and a country would really be in a terrible state if free migration was allowed. Like, for instance, if free migration was allowed out of very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or like, for instance, if you were trying to like reunite Korea or something like this. But hopefully, in most kind of relationships between progressive countries, that sort of strong regulation would not be necessary, and you could just have kind of like a cap on the movement between people between these countries, which is still very high of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. The first wave of migration, which was relevant for millennials and thus myself, was the wave of Poles and Bulgarians under Tony Blair. This wave came about because the European Union had expanded to Eastern Europe, and Poland and Bulgaria had then kind of timed in to being allowed to freely move across Europe. And then, of course, a great deal of them came to the UK because the UK was then one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, both in capita terms and GDP terms. Now, in capita terms, Britain is falling increasingly behind. I think it's most recently fallen behind Italy, and in a few years it's planning. Basically planning. The ruling class is in a few years planning for the UK to fall behind Poland. I think in some other stat we're already behind Slovenia. But at the time, Britain was a better country, was a better place. I'm not just saying that for nostalgic reasons. Under Tony Blair, Britain was growing. A lot of that growth was kind of semi-fake, but a lot of that growth came because of building. And that's especially what Polish and Bulgarian immigrants did. They came and they built things. And I think, interestingly, though this is related to Brexit, one of the strangest things about the Polish-Bulgarian immigration is that it's one of the cases where they actually mostly went home, at least in the case of Poles. I think, again, probably because Poland has massively economically developed over the past 25 years and thus became a tempting target for people who left a poor country and were now going back to one that was barely any poorer than the UK. This led to significant racism and hostility to Eastern Europeans when I was growing up, which demonstrated the great flexibility of British racism. While not mainly due to the arrival of a new group, there was also a great deal of like race hate or whatever you want to name it in the 2000s about the grooming gang scandal. The grooming gang scandal, where is apparently predominantly South Asian men, and by that I don't mean like Indians. It was pretty much exclusively Pakistanis. Organized like pedophilic gangs that exploited mainly young white women that had been discarded by the social services. These were young women that were like 12, 13 or so on, that were regarded as by social services as already lost causes. They were regarded as, sex workers instead of children being horrifically exploited and so on and so forth. And of course, they didn't use the word sex workers. The grooming gang scandal is still mired in darkness. What's emerging now is that the South Yorkshire police didn't just let it happen, but a non-zero amount of South Yorkshire police officers were directly involved in these gangs, were directly involved in the exploitation of these not young women, children, very young women, young girls, whatever. I'm not saying certain words just for the sake of not putting on Ben and Jason's channel various dark terms, but I'm sure you guys can basically imagine what was going on without me explaining it to you. But the degree I can work out what has happened and why it's kind of seen that it was South Asian men that were doing this is because while white people were very happy to organize pedophilic gangs in this way, what happened is the non-white gangs had much more success due to kind of community politics and local institutions feeling less able to crack down upon them for a fear of appearing racist. Olivia Brown says they'll have a higher standard of Poland than UK in another 10 years. I would be surprised if it took 10 years. Brexit. UKIP reform stuff. I would note also that actually on the grooming gangs and Islamization and this kind of stuff, this led to a major wave of fascist violence in the UK, organized around a group called the EDL, also called, they call themselves infidels and stuff like this, who would directly position themselves against the fear of the UK being Islamized. Though at the time there wasn't particularly any large growth in the amount of Muslims in the UK, but they kind of had become kind of prominent and obvious and more involved in politics, especially around the Iraq War, and kind of Muslim Britain had a significant kind of political awakening, came into its political fore, and at the same time there was this kind of around the grooming gangs and just general racist hostility because of increasing immigration from Eastern Europe, which led to the fascist EDL having, it didn't last very long, but 4 or 5 years, they had a significant street presence in the UK. But the kind of softer edge of the British right was around UK reform, who weren't fascistic in any real way, were not kind of organized on the street level, were never really like a mass party. They're trying to become one now, but were always kind of before that, an elite organization that were organizing of course, it would be weird for UKIP to be a mass organization because UKIP had most of their members in the European Parliament, but their aim was to abolish themselves. Their aim in running European elections was to abolish the category of European elections in the United Kingdom. A lot of stuff around Brexit focused on Eastern Europeans, not just because there was significant Eastern anti-European immigration. Jesus, that was an absolutely bungled sentence. There was a great deal of anti-Eastern European racism in the UK, but also because it made sense to frame things in those terms. Because in the case of Brexit, it would actually be the Bulgarians and the Poles and so on and so forth that would actually be banned. Well, not banned. They would be banned from coming to the UK, but they wouldn't be able to freely move to the UK. Yeah, to be clear for non-British people, when I talk about UKIP/reform, I'm talking about the various outfits that Nigel Farage has used to try to push the UK out of alignment with Europe and then just generally gain power and wealth and so on for himself. This was a time before the Boris wave in 2020, where immigration from India was regarded as far more positive than immigration from Bulgaria. I think perceptions of migration from India, as in the question was do you think that migration from India, for example, is more positive or more negative for the UK? And India was +1, 47, 46, while Bulgaria was like -20 or something like that. Concerns about migration and sovereignty were all mixed together. The European Union was regarded as a permanent migration machine, one that will continually seize more power and one that will continually expand. So there was a fear that the European Union would advance in such a way to take away all British independence, while at the same time expanding geographically, for instance, to take in Turkey. And there was a great worry in Britain about like Turkey comes into the European Union because then you have like 85 million Muslims who can immediately, well, obviously that's not the reality, but the idea is that you could just get 10 million Muslims in the UK the next day, and then it's so over, and so on and so forth. Matt says the Brexit thing highlighted the importance of never giving up your currency sovereignty. If you give up your currency, then you're kind of trapped. Yeah, it's true. Like, I think it was much, much, much easier for the UK to leave the European Union because we had our own currency. Like the ways that we'd dug ourselves out the freedoms of the European Union were the things that actually allowed the possibility of us leaving happening, because even despite that, there were 5 years between us voting to leave and actually getting to leave. For a country that was currency integrated, it would be much longer if it was even possible at all. As I mentioned, concerns about immigration drove Brexit, but after Brexit, attitudes to immigration massively brightened. It was taken that we'd solved the issue, had taken back control, and so on. Then Boris Johnson decided to do a funny thing. Boris Johnson decided to quadruple migration, clearly demonstrating the degree to which immigration is just very much under the government's control. There's like, I don't know if this is true in the United States, but there's a weird attitude in the UK where the government's like, oh, we're going to try and reduce migration, as if they don't have control and power over it in some way. But yeah, Boris Johnson changed the law and immigration went up. I can't actually remember what the figures were. Was it? I think it might have been 100,000 a year to 400,000 a year, or maybe 200,000 a year to 800,000 a year. But whatever it was, it quadrupled over a couple of year period. And he decided to quadruple migration during the dark days of COVID. This was meant to solve staffing issues around caring for the old, which is one of the most common liberal arguments around migration directly, as in we need to get people into the UK so they can do shit jobs caring for our elderly, which of course, I think I mentioned on YouTube before, but I think one of the biggest gaps between the degree to which a certain group of people should be valued and the degree to which they are actually valued and are actually paid and so on is carers. Carers, either kind of carers in-house or carers that go on home visits, are the people who care for our elderly, and also, just for our elderly, but disabled people and so on. They're a completely essential group of people who do an incredibly important job, and they're treated like absolute complete shit and are paid nothing at all for an incredibly hard job, which is absolutely essential. And indirectly, in the sense that we need more immigration in order to make sure that we don't have too many old people and so on. Due to COVID and the knock-on effects of COVID, as well as just the general decline of Britain, at the same time, the country started to go massively downhill. This led to exactly what you would expect, and immigration is once again seen as an enormous issue in the UK. Recently, there was when Starmer was talking to Trump, when Trump was visiting the UK, some like idiot right-wing journalist was like, Mr. Trump, what do you think of the small boats crisis? And he was like, what? And he was like, the small boats crisis. He was like, what? The small boats crisis. And obviously Trump had no idea what the fuck he was talking about. But there seemed to be a strange delusion in Britain that various foreign countries have any idea about the small boats crisis. Well, I don't think anyone outside of France knows or gives a shit. Like, even among like racists who are interested in Britain, I don't think the concern is about the small boats as opposed to the asylum seekers who are actually here. But starting in 2021, tens of thousands of migrants began crossing the channel in small boats, organized by smuggling gangs. This is interesting because the literal first crossings happened in 2018, but then didn't become like a popular thing until 2021. But there's nothing necessarily stopping this from happening earlier. Happening much earlier. The much earlier was limited by the lack of boats, but kind of large migration of people in camps in the European Union started after the Syrian war, where because of Syria's position on the Mediterranean coast, and because lots of Syrians got into Turkey, which is then it's quite easy to get from Turkey to Europe, because Turkey's in Europe, at least a bit of it is. Loads and loads of Syrians were able to illegally get into the European Union, and because conditions in their country were so obviously bad, and Syria being so obviously bad was an essential part of the West's regime change effort in Syria, which eventually succeeded last year. Congratulations to them. And now they're trying to support the Syrians. They had to let the Syrians stay there, or at least until last year, when they started to try to get rid of them. But these happened 2011, 2012, 2013. I think the big crisis point was 2016. But again, the wave of migrants kind of hit Europe, but then didn't try to illegally get into the UK until quite a few years later. Only, and I put really strong scare quotes in this, only 133 people have died this way, which is far less than the Mediterranean, where thousands and thousands of people have died trying to cross the Mediterranean from Africa and from Syria. Well, not necessarily direct from Syria. Normally they push off from Turkey, but you know what I mean. Well, I guess that would be deaths in the Aegean, but you know what I mean. But still an absolutely horrible figure. The British and French governments have proved ineffective at stopping this migration flow. So obviously these people are casting off in France, and not just in France, but in a particular strip in France. But of course, there's really, really no incentives for the French to work to stop migrants from coming into Britain. Like, they want them to leave. They want them to get out. And so France's only concern is that this leads to like flows of money to illegal gangs that would also engage in other forms of criminality. But apart from that, France has absolutely no vested interest in helping Britain stop the small boats flow. And these large camps exist in France, in northern France, because of Europe's failure to deal with the movement of the desperate into Europe. So, of course, we had this big point in 2016 where a large number of Syrians came into Europe, and these camps were set up. Either they're legal camps, they're illegal camps, as in one set up by migrants themselves. And now, for instance, most people trying to cross the English Channel are Afghans, so a lot of them are Vietnamese, which is interesting. And Vietnamese are, Asians and Vietnamese people are completely not in the discussion about asylum seekers in the UK. The focus is exclusively on Muslim young men. While Asians, both in terms of Vietnamese people crossing on boats, and also more generally Chinese people and so on, are regarded or just not discussed in the British context. Sorry, to be clear, also in the British context, when you say Asian, you don't include South Asians, you mean East Asians. These people crossing on small boats are normally trying to claim asylum and don't kind of successfully illegally immigrate to the UK, in the sense that they do manage to cross the channel, but they're all picked up by the Coast Guard or just by the police once they reach shore, because they're in these tiny little dinghies and so on. And the British asylum system does not work. The UK asylum seeking system is both dire at giving people asylum and in deporting them, which incites everyone involved in the system. Asylum seekers are given a pathetic stipend and banned from working, meaning that many of them, of course, work illegally. And by pathetic stipend, I mean like they get like £20 a week. I think it's literally Asylum seeker payments UK. Ooh, 49.18. Is that a month? Ooh, you get 49.18 a week. Oh. Sorry, the British government is trying to put me down. They don't want me talking about how little they give to migrants. But yes, they get a mighty £41 a week, or 48, and that's only if they aren't given meals by the British state. They are given meals by the British state in the hotel they're living or whatever. They get £9 a week. They're housed in hotels, mostly in working class areas, in order to reduce costs. I think also just to keep this newest wave of hoi polloi away from those who are better regarded by the British state. But these costs are still shockingly high, costing billions of pounds a year. I think the costs have just been reduced to about 2 billion. So not the most billions amount, but still a billions amount. Recently, they managed to cut this by 30% by placing them in even shitter accommodations or making them just share rooms. This leads to a great deal of deathly bored young men with little to do but go around and work illegally and commit petty crimes, which is not exactly a thing, as in deathly bored young men engaging in antisocial behaviour. It's not something that Britain is thin on already. This system of housing asylum seekers led to murderously furious riots in Britain last summer, which by murderously furious, I mean they made significant efforts to burn one asylum-seeking hotel down and did manage to start a minor fire inside of it. And these riots are never far away from reigniting. Matt Gilbert says Asian asylum seekers are discussed in Odd Howard's book. I know Odd Howard's government ran and stopped the boats. They're saying, oh, sorry. Matt Gilbert is saying Asian asylum seekers are a big political issue in Australia. Soon says, but as migration then solved the issue with the lack of caretakers, kind of. And how can you even eat for that? You eat poorly. And Jason says, hi. Don't worry, Jason, we've only got 2 more slides to go. Asylum seekers is not a problem which is going to go away for Western countries. Forced migration from areas of the world being destroyed by imperialism, violence, civil wars, and climate change will only increase as time goes on. This is going to become more and more of a problem, as not only will the numbers increase, but the capacity to take them will decrease. Europe is fundamentally in decline, and the direction of things seems to be accelerating that tendency, not diminishing it. Europe now wants to rearm so we can fight Russia, but that rearmament seems to be coming in giving trillions of dollars to the United States. European Union just made a beautiful trade agreement with the United States, where the United States would only charge the European Union 30% tariffs. In exchange, they would get to charge 0% tariffs on American stuff coming to the European Union. While at the same time, Europe agreed to buy $1 trillion worth of arms to the United States and $1 trillion of European investment in the United States. And in exchange, the United States promised to buy €0 of European arms and promised to invest €0 in the EU's economy. So that's the kind of delightful deal that Europe is agreeing to as they're kind of further pushed out of being the center of the world. And it seems that Europe wants to rearm just by deepening its vassalage to the United States. Jason asked, is this during Trump? Yeah, this was agreed like 2 weeks ago. It hasn't luckily been implemented yet. The French, at least, are opposed to it, but I think it works in such a way now in the European Union that they can just the French can't stop it. The decline of the United States means that global violence will increase, as I discussed last week, and globalization means violence won't stay where it is. For instance, in South Sudan, there's a genocide, a horrible genocide in South Sudan. Millions of people are being killed, millions of people are being starved, millions of people aren't being killed, but you know what I mean. Millions of people are being starved, millions of people could be killed, but it's still contained because Sudan is in such a kind of marginal position, surrounded by the Sahara Desert. The kind of cities of South Sudan are very isolated in the positions they are, that the migrational flow can't really escape from there. But as war spreads to richer countries, as war spreads to countries that have more connections, that have more, the people and they have more ability to leave, this flow of migration and asylum will only increase, while at the same time, Europe will be far and far less capable of coping with this flow of migration. Which brings us back again to the question of how can you possibly enforce an immigration system? How do you actually limit immigration without total surveillance or murderous borders, or more likely murderous borders, and whatever else? Public opinion favors keeping people out, but is rather less enthusiastic about deportation, and even less about people dying on the border. I think this goes pretty much universally. Thus, even if we accept that we should have limits on immigration, this doesn't really get us anywhere. To be dull, what is the solution? Global socialism, where immigration stops becoming a problem because there aren't these massive inequalities between countries. So there aren't some countries that have this immense pull to people that people want to migrate to a certain country, while in other countries they don't have this, crisis and war, which is driving people to distraction, to expulsion, and so on. Until then, it seems like what most countries will be doing is not solving the migration problems, but doing their best to cope with it. And socialists, when they have power, should seek to do what they can for the world without alienating their national base, and try to make clear to their national base how, trying to serve the world also benefits the people at home. And with that, we've reached the end of today's thingamabob. I will now go back and we will briefly show the summary slide. If anyone wants to ask any quick questions, but they will have to be quick because I'm going to get rid of myself. And Jason Miles is going to interview the bassist from Megadeth. But then how would Britain get workers to take care of the elderly? Well, it's not like there aren't British workers willing to work in care homes. There are plenty of British workers in care homes. Though, of course, what's not going to happen soon is British people looking after their parents outside the context of care homes. It's going to be kind of externalized to some sort of part of the working class, regardless if that working class is national or has just recently arrived to Britain. Could everyone lend a hand? Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's an interesting question. Under socialism, how would we care for the elderly? I've never really thought about it. Maybe there's already a book on it. Maybe there's a nice chapter on it in the stuff that like Sunkara and Ben Burgess are doing. Del Solverde says, thanks, Stefan. It's certainly a thorny issue. It is. Yeah, I don't know. I probably won't just go back to just talking about why we shouldn't have open borders next week. I'll try and think of something else. But maybe I'll do that one in future. But I will leave you all, and then you will have literally maybe about, well, actually, I say you're going to have like 5 minutes until Jason is on, but Jason doesn't start on time. Though maybe this time he will, because the bassist from Megadeth, his publicist has been like, yeah, do it exactly this time. So enjoy that. See you all later. Goodbye.